Hello, I will present our paper, Negation in Norwegian, an annotated dataset. First of all, I'd like to talk about what negation is. There is a strong definition of negation, which is that it reverses the truth value of a proposition. So for example, given the sentence, I need coffee, we can negate this sentence and we get, I do not need coffee. But negation is not necessarily only for propositions. There are other places where we find negation, for example in imperatives, in conditionals, for example no, never. There are no propositions. The scope, which we will talk more about later, is outside of the expression itself. And negation is more complex than people tend to think. It's more than just some frequent adverbs or determiners that negate. Negation in Norwegian is largely similar to English. For example, we use mostly a sentential adverb as our main negator, but there are some differences due to the fact that Norwegian is a V2 language. So for example, we see in this sentence, det fikk hun ikke, that she did not receive, that the position of the elements are a bit different, but this is mainly syntactic. However, there are some other differences. For example, Norwegian has agreement for adjectives. So in the three phrases here, blir ganske meningsløst, hensynsløse regnskogødeleggere, men ikke smakløs. We see that the negating adjectival ending løs agrees with the neuter gender, the plural number, and the common gender, respectively. I will briefly mention the bioscope corpus, which is the first negation corpus, and two very influential corpora for our work, the Conan-Doyle corpus and the SFU corpus. And please refer to our paper for more details regarding related work. Now I will talk a bit about annotation scheme and how we annotated negation in our paper. We followed many before us and split negation into cues and scopes. Cues are indicated in boldface and scopes in brackets. A cue is what allows us to see that there is negation in a sentence. So for example, in the first sentence here, han kan ikke synge I det hele tatt. He cannot sing at all. We see that ikke is the cue. It's what allows us to see that there is negation. And the scope is the rest of the sentence. Han kan synge I det hele tatt. He can sing at all. And we see that, for example, the scopes here are discontinuous. They can be on either side. And we see here an example of a subtoken cue. Eit uferdig og til tider kaotisk produkt. An unfinished and at times chaotic product. Both cues and scopes can be subtoken, discontinuous, multi-token, or single token. We also make a difference between what we call true discontinuous scopes and just discontinuous scopes, where true discontinuous scopes are separated by more than just the cue. It's quite common that the cue splits the scope, but if there is something else like another sentential adverb that comes between the scope, then that is called a true discontinuous scope. Now I will talk about our annotation process. So we have done sentence level annotation, where we had 6 annotators who were all language technology students from the University of Oslo. Each document were annotated by 2 annotators, and a third annotator would then go over those 2, compare them, and curate the document to create the final version of the dataset. We had an iterative process to build up our guidelines with weekly meetings to discuss problematic instances or things that were not sufficiently covered by the guidelines. And then these Unexpected problems were discussed at these weekly meetings and later discussed with the other authors of this paper. And more details are found in the paper, but I would like to go over some examples of problems or slightly more challenging parts of our annotation effort. The first of them is affixal negation, where it can be difficult to separate between lexicalized items and productive negation. So we don't really want to annotate negation which is not used as negation. And so, for example, with affixal negation, we have a problem where a lot of words, if we take, for instance, the negating prefix u, which means un, then there are many words that start with u that don't necessarily indicate negation. There's also the process of lexicalization, that maybe a word used to be seen as negated, but now the non-negated version is no longer available to native speakers, and so it's not really seen as a negation of the word. Prefixes can also have different senses. So, for example, in the case of u, we have, if it's used together with nouns, we have uven and uvær, which means enemy and bad weather. So it means bad and not really not or un. And affixal negation carries a different sense than just normal negation. So, for example, as in English, uredd versus ikke redd, unafraid versus not afraid, don't have the exact same sense, and some choose to not annotate this kind of negation, but we have, and it's also quite common. Another problem is this difference between negation and modality. So modality is not always easy to separate from negation. So, for example, in this sentence, det kommer neppe som noe overraskelse at, it hardly comes as a surprise that. Then neppe is a modal element that indicates that this sentence is on, it's not very probable, it's on the almost negated side. But these are not annotated by us. We do not annotate cases of modality that cannot be separated from negation. But if we can separate them, even though there might be a modal element scoping over the negation, as in the case of this sentence, men kanskje ikke helt troverdig, but maybe not completely credible, the Q ikke scopes over helt troverdig, and this negation is again inside the scope of kanskje, and since these are separable, we have annotated them. Another problem, slightly related to what was mentioned for affixal negation, is the case of lexical negation. So we have different ways of indicating negation that's not just common items that you might see in a reference grammar, but for example words like fravær, absence, and mangel, lack, can also indicate negation. In this sentence, fraværet av mer enn bare et kvarter musikk, the absence of more than just 15 minutes of music, is a different type of negation. And these are difficult for annotators to agree on, not easy to judge. We generally say that if it is possible to rephrase something as negation, so in this case it is not there, so it's absent, then it counts as negation, also if there's no modal element. And these are not easy. There have been many discussions, and especially in the beginning there was a low inter-annotator agreement on these items because they are more difficult to define. Here we have some corpus statistics. We have the 10 most common cues for our dataset, their translation into English, their frequency, and their ambiguity rate. The ambiguity rate here shows to what degree homographs exist in the corpus that do not indicate negation. So, for example, ikke, you can see, have an ambiguity rate of 3. because there are some elements where ikke is part of fixed phrases that do not indicate negation. U has a high ambiguity rate because of the things we've discussed earlier. And we also see the lexical item mangle, lack, has a higher ambiguity rate, which is true for many lexical items. We also see that ikke is by far the most frequent Q, but that affixal negation is also quite common. Here are the total counts of various elements of negations in our corpus. We see that we have 11,346 sentences in total, and of these, 2,332 sentences have negation. There are 2,672 Qs, so there has to be one Q per negation, but a sentence can have more than one negation. 21 of these are discontinuous, 304 are multi-token, and 665 are affixal. There are 2,635 scopes, 1,842 of these are discontinuous, and 566 are true discontinuous, as we talked about, and 37 of them are null, which means that the negation is implicit. Since we do sentence level annotation, there are some negations that have a reference to a sentence coming earlier, for example, such as no, which might be an answer to something, and these therefore have implicit scopes. In order to say something about the usefulness of our corpus, we ran a negation graph parsing algorithm from Kurtz et al. And we performed 5 runs with 5 different seeds, and the average with standard deviation is reported in the table you see here. And it is the point to root that performs best, which means that all dependencies in the negation graph point to the root, which is the Q of the sentence. These results tell us that the models have similar results as for English, which also shows that our annotations are consistent enough to be useful for the model. However, the models have a tendency to pick slightly shorter spans, and they also generalize poorly for new cues. So especially these lexical items are not picked up very well from the by the model. Now I will say something about future work. So this dataset is annotated on a dataset that has also been annotated with fine-grained sentiment analysis, NOREC-FINE, which is a dataset we've worked on previously. And we would like to use these new annotations to combine negation and fine-grained sentiment. It has been shown that one problem with fine-grained sentiment analysis is that negation is not always properly picked up on, and it's a source of errors in these models. So we hope that we can combine our annotations now that we have a dataset where both fine-grained and negation is annotated. And we urge the community to use our corpus. The annotation guidelines and the corpus are available at our GitHub page. And last but not least, I would like to thank the annotators, Anders, Helen, Lilja, Karina, and Alexandra. Thank you for your efforts, and thank you for your attention.